I'm one of the founding directors of Baca Architects. We've been going now for just over a decade. And for one reason or another, we've found ourselves as one of the figureheads dealing with climate change, and in particular, the most visible aspect of that, flooding. And coming back to the digital analogy, at home we back up our data with a hard drive, USB sticks, we have the cloud. But strangely, we're not designing our cities in the same way. We're resolved to single lines of defense. We're building to 1 in 100 year flood levels, and as we saw in Cumbria recently, one of those flood defenses, which had only been constructed for 5 years, was breached. So all these very high-tech data that's out there, some of it is wrong. So how do we deal with this uncertainty? So part of our approach is not to rely on technology, assume failure, and try to make things a little bit more intuitive. So just very quickly and briefly, we've been involved in the most critical project out of these is called the LIFE project, Long-Term Initiatives for Flood Risk Environments. And it was the first time in UK policy, and the equivalent policy in Holland is called Making Room for the River, is instead of building flood defences, to allow water, to make space for water, to allow it into your built environment in a predetermined fashion. Now, as an architect and an urban designer, that's very challenging and very exciting, because up until now we hid water, we've been culverting rivers. So how do we embrace water? How do we live with it? Where's that water going to go? Because there's going to be some phenomenal quantities. I'm going to focus today on the Amphibious House, but the Amphibious House is just one component of a body of research which we've worked on over the last decade. There's a whole new chapter that's been introduced to the new Metric Hambach, which is now sort of the architect's Bible, which will tell you some of the core principles of what one needs to embrace in terms of the types of flooding and how one either avoids, elevates, flood resilience, flood resistance, a palette of tools which as a designer one can approach design. And just a quick plug to the book. That 10 years worth of work, all those documents have all been compressed into a new book which hit the stands just recently over Christmas. Today I'm going to talk about the building for which we're probably most well known for is the Amphibious House, and it's quite nice that even the Daily Mail even said positive things. They've said a lot of negative things about a few of my buildings, but it's really captured the public's imagination. Our client lives on a wonderful site on the River Thames, not unlike many other sites. But during the winter of 2012, really hit by severe flooding. As you can see here, he lives in the functional floodplain, flood zone 3B. The Environment Agency does not let you build housing here, so if one wants to build a dwelling, it has to be a replacement dwelling. Now, there's a number of challenges currently in the UK planning system. The Environment Agency asks that you elevate your new ground floor above a 1 in 100 year flood event, plus 300 mil, plus 300 freeboard, so it's quite a substantial amount. Equally, many areas, because they're along the River Thames, are also greenbelt, so there's covenants rules about how high these ridge heights can be. So at the moment, there's a real conflict in policy. So if my house floods, I want to replace it, you're kind of trapped to this level if you want to do an elevated property. And if, in some areas, we're looking at a current site in Shepperton, it's 12 steps up, and it's an elderly couple. It's going to get winter, it's going to get icy. I think it's a little bit unreasonable to ask those to go up and down those steps every day, especially in old age. And equally, it dislocates you from your garden. And we have seen some examples in New Orleans where they've elevated this ground floor over 2.5 meters. So rather than having the vocabulary of the veranda, which is this lovely shaded area, this interstitial space between yourself and the garden, these have become balconies in the air waiting for this 1 in 100 year event. So they're quite incongruous with their setting. Whereas an amphibious house has the benefit, which means your ground level, so your primary floors, are at ground level. You can create a lower ground floor, which provides the buoyancy. You can put all your environmental kit in there, but it displaces it, provides sufficient lift during a flood. And when we approached the Environment Agency, we talked about a floating house, but we didn't own the river. So the Amphibious House gave us the best balance of solutions over, for example, the stilted property. Things we had to deal with the Amphibious House. First of all, there was no precedent in the UK for planning. So we had to work with some colleagues over in in the United States and in the Netherlands to help us provide sufficient precedent to provide the base case to show that this would work. There was no building regs. That still exists, and we're trying to work with LABC to start to bring displacement and buoyancy technologies into the building regs. And then environmental, we also need it to be low carbon where we can, because the more new houses we build, we're likely to exacerbate climate change. So these are the constituent parts of a contemporary sort of modern methods of construction amphibious house. We have the wet dock, so if you think about the Royal Docks or the Albert Dock in Liverpool, man-made structure. Now, it retains the ground around the outside. It has a permeable base, which means it's hydrologically linked to the river. So as the river rises, it doesn't overtop it. It comes up slowly. Just going back to, we'll go on to the intuitive landscape in a minute. Number 2 is the buoyant foundation. That's just simple waterproof concrete basement. That's then tethered with things which we call dolphins, which are just masts. And then the key component which links all these together is the flexible connection, which is all of your utilities, foul, drainage, electricity, and water. So this is a cross-section through the site. You can see the basement there, and how the house will rise during a flood event. And it is, in fact, designed to travel over 2.5 meters high. If through climate change we need it to be a little bit higher, then we can just extend the tethering posts. The building needs about approximately 2 meters worth of water around it before it starts to move. I suspect the video is not going to work. So as a backup, we've got some slides which show you the construction method. So you can see there's Matthew from Technica, very good engineer. We pumped the water, and we did 2 float tests. We did one with the basement to make sure that hadn't binded to the wet dock, and then when the superstructure and the house was floodly laden with furniture, so if the client puts a bookcase in the corner, we can calibrate it. And one of the assumptions that we have with this house, and we sort of started to incorporate this into the planning documents and building regs, is that we treat this like a car. So every year you take your car for an MOT, we would like it to be tested. So you fill the dock with water, you test that the traveling mechanisms work, and it all works perfectly. Now, one of the things I just wanted to talk to you about very quickly about over-reliance on technology. One of the big issues that they had in New Orleans, and if you go back there, it's quite incredible, but they've rebuilt the flood defense wall, and they've built suburbia directly behind it with these beautifully manicured lawns. And they go, well, it's a 1 in 100 year flood event. It flooded 10 years ago. We're free for the next 90 years. The problem is, on the other side of that levee, the water creeps up. The hurricane comes, it will be overtopped. So what we've devised is a thing called the intuitive landscape. So what we have in the garden is a series of flood cells. So it's just a series of water terraces, and by the time the second terrace has been inundated with water, the house should have started to move. And we've taken that whole theme to a park in Paris. So that sits along the River Seine. And as the park starts to flood, it's an early indicator to the residents that you should start to move to safe havens. So that I think there is an absolute place for technology, and with apps, we can use the flood warnings. But within a built environment, particularly with flooding, one shouldn't be over-reliant on technology. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Oh, sorry.
A fascinating project. When I first saw it, it was kind of, it's one of those projects you think, are they really doing that? Is that really happening? And I suppose the answer to the question is yes. And I suppose it does beg the question, therefore, is this, and what do you think, Richard, is this a one-off? Is this a repeatable structure? Is this just like a one-off flight of fancy that you've managed to get some punter to pay for?
I think that's a very, very valid question. And what's interesting today is I'm actually meeting a large developer to talk this through. Because of the lack of building regs at the moment, our flood-resilient buildings have been reliant on privateers because they can build their housing without having to borrow any money. That doesn't help the everyday person, doesn't help the people in Cumbria. So what we're trying to do now is encourage CLG, encourage City Hall to support building regs embracing displacement and flotation structures within the building regs. As soon as that comes forward, that unlocks mortgages, because if you want to get a mortgage, you need LABC warranty. As soon as that chain falls into place, you will see these being rolled out. And we have, every time this appears on Grand Design Show, the phone gets busy, and we get 100 or so phone calls. So there's a need there. There's a taste. We just need the government to catch up.
And what sort of costs are you? What is the premium on top of a standard house to do this? I imagine quite a lot.
It's not as much as you would suspect. This was more expensive because it's on a private island and didn't have any road access, so everything had to go across the river. But broadly, the the basement is the same as a basement that you build in central London. So the only uplift is the wet dock. So in that sense, it's only 10–15% more. But what one has to remember is these are normally premium sites. So if you can maintain insurance and you've got uninterrupted views of the river, it kind of pays for itself.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing on my mind is maintenance. You say an annual MOT. Who does that? So
within our contracts with the client, we've obliged them to undertake that themselves in the same way you would be a boat owner. And there's a very simple regime that one follows. So the house is floated once every year. Some components will last 5 years, and some components will last 20 years. And so at the moment, it's down to the client.
So you have an annual flooding event. Anyone got any questions for Richard? It's certainly a very fascinating project, and it's good to hear about it. Anyone got any questions or points or worries, concerns that they want to raise with Richard here? Does anyone want to buy one? No? Okay. Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time.
Fascinating project.